I'm thrilled to introduce our next moderator. We have an avid ocean advocate and the founder and director of Fish On to bring up. Please welcome Anupa Asokan.
Thanks, everyone, for the warm welcome. I'm just going to go ahead and bring up my fellow panelists here. We have our hometown Laguna hero, Chad Nelson, CEO of the Surfrider Foundation. Where is everyone else? Keith Malloy, surfer, fisherman, filmmaker. Ramon Navarro, big wave surfer, here all the way from Chile, and Dr. Chugi Sepulveda. Hopefully I didn't butcher everyone's introductions here. All right. Thank you all for joining me. Before we dig in to the meaty part of our conversation, poor Chad has been stuck on several panels with me in the last couple of weeks, and so he's probably tired of this question. But it's my favorite question to ask everyone before we get started and start talking about, the things that we do for the ocean, and it's how did you get connected to the ocean? Was there someone or some activity that really kind of gave you that moment that you wanted to be an activist or advocate or continue to study the place that we all know and love? So, Chad, I'm going to just start with you.
Sure. First of all, I grew up here in Laguna Beach, so it's not very hard to fall in love with the ocean if you grew up in a place that has such a magical coastline as this one. I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but I also watched it change here over the 54 years that I've been living in town. Before that, when I was a toddler, I actually lived on Saipan, a small island in Micronesia, where my dad taught science to the local Chamorro people. So I also got a really cool introduction to sort of indigenous knowledge and people who are connected to the ocean, and I think a fundamentally different way than we are. They see themselves as part of the ocean ecosystem, not separate from it, and that really created a lasting impression on me, and I think that's something we got to get back to, frankly.
Keith?
Yeah, so I'm also one of these lucky people like you that grew up in Southern California. My parents loved the beach. My dad surfed. We actually lived a bit inland in Ojai, California, so it wasn't right there for us every day. So it being a half an hour away, drive down out of the canyon, made it even more enticing. So yeah, just lucky to grow up in this area and fell in love with the ocean at a very young age.
Well, I hate to repeat similar story. I actually grew up in Orange, which is a half hour from here. And as a young child, I was left at the pier all day long, at the Aliso Pier, right down here in Laguna. Mom and Dad, they were very dedicated, and they heard me whining all the time about wanting to go fishing all day, so they would just drop me off. And now CPS would probably take them away, because you can't just do that to an 8-year-old, but I'd stay there all day. And so I'm an advocate for sustainable fishing, and I really enjoy the ocean on many levels, and that's just, I guess, my drive to go fishing and hunting as well. It kind of pushed me into this direction, and I'm glad I'm here.
Well, for me, my grandpa's a fisherman, and my dad is a fisherman. Pretty much my whole family is a fisherman, so I grew up with just seaweed and fish my whole life since day one. So the only thing I remember in the beginning. So the ocean is part of my life pretty much since I have memories in my head.
I don't look like your typical fisherman, but I too actually grew up fishing. It was my dad that taught me how to fish on the Gulf Coast of Florida, so species that you might not be familiar with. I grew up catching red drum and speckled trout in the mangroves and the flats on the Gulf Coast. Ended up studying marine science because I realized it was a thing that I could do. Took up other ocean activities. I've been a long-time Surfrider volunteer, and I ultimately went back to that first passion of fishing, and I just started a brand new organization called Fish On, working with other fishermen, fisherwomen, anglers, spearfishers who want to be a part of solutions to ocean conservation. So I'll make a plug towards the end too, and I encourage you to check it out. I'm a one-woman show, so I have to take the opportunity when I can. So the topic that we're going to be discussing today are marine protected areas. And just out of curiosity, raise your hand if you've heard of MPAs, or marine protected areas. Oh, great. Love that. I'm just going to kind of lay the foundation for what they are and what they do. And then we can kind of dig into different perspectives on MPAs. So most of you are familiar, marine protected areas are essentially like a state park or a national park, but underwater. They're in the ocean. And they're often designated to protect key habitats or ecosystems. And they come in different flavors. So, it might be a fully protected area, which are often called refuges or marine reserves. We have a state marine reserve right here off of Laguna. And those limit all extractive activity. So no drilling for oil, no fishing, no collecting of things like shells or anything like that. And then a step down from that, we have conservation areas here in California, and you might be allowed to recreationally fish in those state marine conservation areas, for example. And then we have things called, we have marine protected areas that are actually lightly protected. There are a lot of activities allowed within them. Some of them are industrial activities like industrial fishing. Our federal national marine sanctuaries are kind of in this lightly protected category where a lot of commercial fishing is occurring. Other industries like aquaculture might be cited within them and things like that. So depending on what you can and can't do within these marine protected areas, I mean, common sense, right? Like you're gonna have different outcomes. The ecosystem will be more or less protected based on what's happening within them. And it's important to note that this is just like one tool in the toolbox of things that we can do to conserve our oceans. And it works kind of in tandem with some of the other topics that we're going to be talking about here up on stage. So what it really comes down to, right, is how do we want to engage with the ocean, and what do we want to see in the future of our ocean? So with that like foundation on MPAs, I want to dig into more of like our perspectives of how we want to interact with the ocean and the future that we want to see for the next generation and the generations after that. And Chad, you mentioned this in your short intro. I think it's a really important and, great opportunity. We have a teachable moment here because Laguna has a really amazing protected area off the coast. And you grew up here, so you saw it before the marine protected area came into place, and you've seen some of the impacts of having that protected zone here. So can you reflect a little bit on what you've seen happen right here in Laguna?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up probably less than a mile from where we're sitting right now, and as a teenager, I worked right across the street as a lifeguard, which some other folks in this room did with me. And this was in the mid-'80s. And like so many kids here, I fell in love with the ocean, and I couldn't get enough of it. And I was endlessly curious about what was going on out there. So I started free diving and scuba diving and fishing and spearfishing. And my buddies and I couldn't really catch any fish, and we thought we were just bad at it. And so we talked to the elder lifeguards, guys who had been around here in the 50s and 60s, and they just looked at us matter-of-factly and said, it's fished out. And at the time, I was 16, 17 years old, I was like, oh, that's just what it is. It's fished out, meaning you should have been here, we caught all the fish, there's none left for you. And it was true, it was pretty sparse, and if you went free diving, the seafloor was covered with purple urchins, and they call it an urchin barren. And basically what happened is the system was out of balance. So the predators of the urchin had been caught, lobsters and fish, otters gone long ago. And so they would go crazy, and they didn't have any natural predators, and they would eat all the kelp, which is what they eat. So they killed all the kelp beds. So it was just this blank sea of purple urchins. It was not particularly interesting and there's no fish to catch. I went off to college and grad school and came back, in the late 90s, and this marine protection area process started. So they talked about starting to protect areas. Very controversial, and we'll get into that a little bit, because the most important habitats are also the best places to fish. So the conservationists and the fishermen wanted the same spots, and that was like where the tensions came in. But ultimately, Laguna was set up as a marine reserve, fully no-take marine reserve about 10, 11 years ago. And if you go out there today, it is unrecognizable from when I was a kid. It is teeming with fish. There's lobsters under every rock, and the kelp beds are flourishing. And so it's actually, a real conservation success story, because I raised my kids in town too, and they grew up with a healthier ocean offshore here than I did. And so it shows just sort of the effectiveness of these marine protected areas. It turns out if you leave nature alone, it does a great job by itself to come back. And it also is an optimistic story about the health of the ocean when most of the news is pretty bad. So it didn't come without some pain and sacrifice to get there, but it is pretty extraordinary. And about a network of marine protected areas was established up and down the California coast. It's one of the only places in the world that has a network. They're actually designed to be interconnected. But ultimately, they take up about 16% of the coastal waters, and about 9% are in marine reserves. So it's actually not that big of an area compared to what's accessible. But again, it was kind of like real estate. It was all about the locations of the places. So. But anyway, great success story here. If you're visiting from town, I encourage you to get out there. It's probably great visibility and calm today, so the snorkeling will be great. Or check it out on a paddleboard.
Yeah, Chad actually took me into the Laguna Reserve, was that a year ago now, maybe? And it was really remarkable and great snorkeling. So if that is an activity you enjoy, I highly, highly recommend it. Keith, in your film, Fish People, which some of you may or may not have seen, you feature Kimmy Werner, who is also a spearfisherwoman, and she said something that really resonated with me, and this is something that I grapple with too when I'm fishing, because you have this respect for the environment that you're in and the creatures that you are sharing it with, and by taking something from that, you're having an impact, right? And so it's this weird conflict of gratitude, but also knowing that you are, I don't know, what's the word? Taking a life from the ecosystem. So I'm curious, from your perspective, also as a spearfisher, how do you define conservation, and what are some ways that you can act to support ocean conservation as a fisher?
Great question. Yeah, I think that, first of all, I think the most respectful way to eat meat or fish, if you're going to do it, is actually taking the life yourself, because you realize how sacred and special that is. If you go to the store and you just have this styrofoam thing, you pull it out and you give it to your kids, they don't even know where it comes from. Who knows where it has come from, So I think Kimmy, loves nature, loves the animals, hardcore spear fisherwoman, but she really doesn't take lightly what she's doing and respects those animals so much. So I think I kind of come from that same place where it's like, you have to be mindful of what you're doing, and we love these animals, and we love this ocean, and I think, the commercial fishermen spend more time on the water than anybody. Like, they love it more than anyone. They can at times overfish areas, and that's why we need the rules and regulations. And realistically, a good part of them, I feel like, would agree with some of the rules and regulations that have been set out. Like, if they weren't set in California, it'd be a whole different place, like it here was in Laguna back in the day. So those rules and regulations are super important. But yeah, like I said, I want to pass on fishing to my kids and my family. I'm happy that California has a thick book of rules and regulations, and you have to study them to know, because there's so many, and they change seasonally. And that's all an important part of keeping the ocean beautiful and so that we can all use it.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about those regulations. I kind of referred to it as managing the ocean, but at the end of the day, it's really about managing people and how we interact with the ocean. Chewy, my next question is for you, but I just want to kind of put this in global perspective a little bit. So there's a big intergovernmental panel, and they look at biodiversity around the world, which is kind of the variety of plant and animal life that we have. And the biggest threats to our ocean are, number one, overfishing, and I'm talking more like industrial scale at a global level. Number two, how we use the ocean and how we're developing things like aquaculture, drilling for oil, offshore wind even, and you're changing the environment in that way. And then third is actually climate change. And then if you zoom in to a local level, those might play out in different ways, or different threats might be more locally relevant. And Chugi, your work is focused more on the fishery side, right? Looking and understanding how fish populations are impacted by the activities that we do in the ocean. Can you reflect a little bit on the changes that you've seen and through your science, the ways that decisions have been made to help positively benefit the species that you work with?
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to have to... I had a whole scripted answer that.
Did I throw it off with my
question?
question?
No, this is good. This is what this is about, right? So I work for a small nonprofit in Oceanside called Pier, and our main focus is to promote sustainable fishing activity. Because I don't want to be a hypocrite. I like fishing, I like to eat fish, and I want my kids to do it, and I want us to support those fishermen that play by the rules. And they need the tools. They need to know how to fish, because our ancestors, and I'm going back one generation, like my father, he would be all into the largest net possible and probably the most efficient way of doing it, because the generations before us really didn't value bycatch or incidental interactions. It was just something that was discarded. So my work is really looking at fish movement patterns and trying to increase selectivity so we can target what we want to target and minimize bycatch. No matter what fishery, you're going to have a little bit of bycatch. Yeah. And some fisheries have a lot. So my group has been trying to work with fishermen to design the tools so they can go out and harvest the target and not impact the other resources. However, it's the consumer, and Ramon and I were talking about it. The consumer drives it. Because if we do not reward our local fishermen for playing by the rules, and we still go to Costco and we buy fish from Singapore or whatever nation that's caught outside of everybody's EEZ, and we can't even trace where it came from, we're actually hurting our local fishermen. We need to not look at our pocketbook when we buy our fish or our produce, like last night's farm dinner. That was beautiful. It was awesome. I can bet you we could find some of the components much cheaper somewhere else, but where do they come from? We need to reward those activities. We need to reward those that provide us the fish. So that's the backbone of what my group does. And I think that's the larger topic we want to talk about, right? It's the consumer. The consumer, we need to know where our fish comes from. We need to know what we eat. Everything we do to this planet, we need to understand those impacts and understand that there is an impact.
Yeah, and can you just add a little more flavor on like the health of some of these fish populations that you study?
Yeah, sure. I'd say that in general, fortunately, I work on some fast-growing fish, both tunas, swordfish, a lot of your pelagic resources. They can rebound quickly, and they're extremely resilient. So in my opinion, you can have sustainable long-term fisheries. However, you need to know a lot about the biology of the animal. You need to know where they go, where they move, who's also exploiting that resource. A good example is white sea bass. When we started the marine protected area placement along the coastline, we were thinking that, these MPAs are really going to help white sea bass, a species that we've studied for quite a few, probably about 15 years. And initially, there was a lot of advocates for MPAs that were saying, oh, white sea bass are going to do great because that's a local kelp forest species and we're going to see them rebound. However, after a lot of tagging data, both funded through the Oldfield Family Foundation and the Flager Foundation, we found that these fish are highly migratory. Even though they're coastal species, they're moving 400 to 500 miles in one season. Half of their life is in Mexico. We still don't have international management. We need to work towards managing our resources from a larger perspective. Looking at, okay, what's happening in Mexico, what's happening in the US. But I do think that the US is doing a good job. And I think that if we're just, it's just slow, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's, a great example of the fact that, it makes sense. The larger a marine protected area is, the more effective it's going to be, but it might not be realistic for the people that want to interact with the ocean, say, catching white sea bass. So fishery management, right, having those regulations on how much you can catch, how big they are, that's another tool that, working with the tool of marine protected areas, can be really effective at protecting the ocean. So fishery management, right, like the rules around the things that we catch and eat, that only covers 1%, less than 1% of species that live in the ocean. So when we think about all of these other threats like climate change, an opportunity to protect the other 99% of things that live in the ocean can be important and valuable. And those reserves, like what we have here off Laguna, are an opportunity to do that. And I also think, as someone that fishes, you have this like myopic view when you get in the ocean, like it's lobster season right now. I'm out there looking for lobster, and you sort of forget about everything else. So again, these tools to protect the broader kind of health of the places that we like to go can be helpful. So Ramon, turning over to you, California and the US like to say that we do such a great job and we're like the leaders in ocean protection. I think federally we've protected 26% of the ocean. Chad mentioned the numbers here locally in California, around 16% of our ocean is protected. But Chile has actually protected over 40% of their waters, which is pretty remarkable.
Sounds really amazing, huh?
Yeah.
It sounds incredible, but the truth is it is not.
Okay.
I mean, on paper, and this is something is really actually dangerous, because on paper, a lot of governments signed these contracts to protect more areas. So we have like giant piece of water protected, but we don't have the tool to protect those areas. We don't have they call it National Service of Fishing. Those guys don't have even boats to control. So what happened in Chile right now, we have these amazing marine protected areas that nobody can control. So pretty much fishermen do whatever they want there, like commercial fishermen go there in fishing, and we don't have that actually real control to what happened in those areas. So it's pretty amazing to see on papers, president just sign and talk about, and the whole world say, wow, Chile's kind of the leader of this. But talking with fishermen, everyone go to fish in those places because nobody control there, and it's more fish. So if we put in like true examples, and what actually works in Chile is when local communities protect areas, and they take control of those places. For example, like Juan Fernandez, Robinson Crusoe Island, I don't know if you hear about it. That place, they have like the whole area protected by the government, but they control it. Under the whole community, they have their own regulation, and they just driving around, and when they see boats, they go there and pretty much with guns take it out of the protected zone. So on paper sounds really good, but the reality is way different than what it looks like.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true here. We say 26%, but it's all kind of remote areas in the Pacific, and we haven't necessarily done a good job of protecting different ecosystems, like coral reefs, for example, or maybe kelp forests and different habitats around the waters in the United States. You were telling me a little bit about visiting the Juan Fernandez Islands and seeing the marine life around there. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what that's like?
Yeah, I got pretty lucky to be a couple times there.
Yeah.
And as I said in the beginning, my whole family is fisherman. I'm starting diving since 9 years old, so also a diver and a fisherman. And I've been traveling with surfing in a lot of places in the world. And by far, those places, Juan Fernandez and Alejandro Serkic Island, is the more pristine ocean I ever seen in my life. It's something incredible. And those guys, they have like bad times in the 70s because there's so many lobsters there. Mm-hmm. So the industrial lobster just pretty much take everything in the 70s, and they realize pretty much the lobster is going to disappear, and they start in their own control. And so they put out the big company was put all the lobsters from there. They put the company out of the island, and by the local community take the control and make their own regulations. So now in Juan Fernandez and these places, they only can get lobster in the season with tramps. They're not allowed to dive into it. And basically what it is right now is just the more pristine ocean you can ever see. It's crazy. You jump into the water there and just all the fish coming straight to you. It's like hundreds of lobsters everywhere in every cave. And the people just make way more money than just take it out because they understand how important it is, and because it's a local tiny community. It's like 250 fishermen just living there, and the other island is 25 fishermen just for the season. So for me, that's a great example when the local community take control of their own resources, can actually protect for the future. Yeah. And I already understand that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And another example would be like the Cabo Pulmo Marine Reserve in southern Baja. That's another example of the fishing community coming together and protecting an important reef habitat. So a good similar comparison, right? Those islands are what, like 400 miles offshore, pretty far offshore. We have islands off of our coast as well, and Keith, they're more or less in your backyard, sort of, being up in the Santa Barbara area. Can you reflect a little bit on what it's like diving within the Channel? Those are some of our like longest lived and biggest marine reserves that we have in California waters. What's it like being there and around those areas and diving in other places?
Yeah, I think Chugi's been up there quite a bit too, and you know, I've been surfing out there and fishing, and I could learn a lot from Chugi because he does the real science behind it all. But I mean, it's just like the most beautiful stretch of islands. The weather conditions get pretty rough out there, so it doesn't get a ton of traffic. Of course, there's a lot of fishing going on out there, commercial fishing and sports fishing, and yeah, I mean, it's a incredible secret almost. Those islands are out there, but not so many people know about them, and they're pristine and beautiful and amazing. Yeah. I mean, and yeah, there's MPAs out there that exist already, and like I said before, lots of fishing regulations, and you know, fish come and go, and there's great seasons and there's poor seasons fishing, obviously, and I know like the east end of Santa Cruz Island is fished heavily, and there's still more fish there than there are at my local beaches where realistically people don't fish that much. So it's pretty amazing to see how the ocean and the wildlife can sustain itself even with fishing as long as it's regulated.
Yeah, and those areas around the Channel Islands too, right? Like the critically endangered, almost extinct giant black sea bass that we have in California waters has rebounded there much more quickly than other places, and eelgrass beds, which have disappeared along a lot of areas up and down the California coast, are more prevalent around the Channel Islands.
Yeah, I think, you know, where it's positioned off of California, right below Point Conception, we get the different currents that swing through there and just bring such an amazing diversity of healthy animal life there in the ocean and everywhere. So it's a special place.
Yeah. So something that you touched on, Ramon, was enforcement challenges, and I think that is similar everywhere, right? We have this concept called paper parks, where an area is protected on paper, but if you're not enforcing it and people aren't following those rules, you're not going to get the outcomes that area was designated for. California is often heralded, right, for better or worse, I think there are some lessons learned and oversights maybe in the process. There are communities like tribal communities, for example, that weren't necessarily included in the way that they should have been when California's marine protected areas were designated. But it is sort of the best gold standard example that we have of this community process to create these reserves and conservation areas up and down the coast and create them as a network. Chad, you were involved in that process. I've been heavily involved in the 10 years later, what are we going to do now part of it. But I'm hoping that you can share with the audience a little bit about how that process came together and the different stakeholders that were involved to help create the network that we have.
Yeah, sure. And also just to sort of reiterate what Ramon was talking about at both the concept of paper parks. So management of these marine protected areas is like as important as the designation, and drawing some lines on a map and saying this is protected is pretty easy. You can do that in an office, but getting out there in the water and protecting these areas or managing them is actually like expensive and a lot of hard work. So you make a really good point. So when you see these bold proclamations, looking the next level under and understanding what's really going on is key. And yeah, California, I mean, we're one of the, like, you know, the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. We've got tons of resources here compared to almost anywhere else on the earth. And a very progressive pro-environment, population and community. So 10 years ago, this design for this network of marine reserves, that concept came up in response to the sort of poor health of the oceans. And, they broke the coast into regions. They had scientists from up and down these world-class, universities in California like UC Santa Barbara and Scripps kind of designing a science-based process. And part of the goal is that each one of these marine reserves should be connected to the one next to it in terms of like larval transport. So in theory, the fish that are off Laguna, when they're spawning and their little planktonic babies head out into the currents, they could connect with the next one south in San Diego or the next one north. And so the idea is if any one of them gets knocked out by an oil spill or something horrific, they can actually be repopulated by the other ones up and down the coast. So it's pretty sophisticated. They built these community groups that had conservationists, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen. A guy that I grew up, Roger Healy, who I grew up with in town, is a commercial fisherman out of Dana Point. He, for example, was one of the guys talking about these areas. He used to, fish for lobster right out here. Now he's doing it down south. So it's a pretty sophisticated process. It was complex. It was controversial. There was a lot of disagreements. But we ultimately, I think, came up with a network that's working. And getting back to this idea of community, which I think is so important, Laguna has an incredible history of conservation. We have this incredible open space behind us that was basically saved by a bunch of community members who fought for it for decades. And the same thing happened offshore. It was local advocates in this town that really, advocated for this marine reserve, and they're also helping enforce it. My dad is an ocean science teacher, and he had a collector's permit for his aquariums. So we could go down to the beach here and take some of the species for his aquariums. He'd have them for the summer, and then we'd dump them back in the ocean at the end of the summer. Every single time we went down to the beach to go collect, some starfish or a lobster or whatever we could, find for his tank, the lifeguards came because somebody in town called and reported us. But that's, and we had the permit, so it was legit. But it was so good because that's what it takes, is this kind of local engagement and involvement in the process. And we're establishing some marine reserves in Puerto Rico. Their equivalent of California Department of Fish and Wildlife is like non-existent and non-functional. So it's really there. We know that it's not going to be organized statewide or island-wide. It's community by community. And so we're building these community co-managed marine protected areas there. Because if the local community doesn't do it, like the Juan Fernandez Islands, nobody's going to do it. And so there are many ways to get this done. I think the more we focus on the community that's adjacent to these areas and involved, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ramon, you kind of already touched on this and how it's really important that it's a community-led effort, but I was just wondering if you had any comparisons or reflections on the California process versus how this happens in Chile.
I mean, my main point on this is like my dad and my grandpa always say, you harvest the ocean. So you know the ocean really good, and it's exactly when you go to your garden. It's like you pick up what you need. So my dad is a diver. He takes fish and seafood and seaweed to make money. So he always harvests the ocean since he was a little kid to make the best product to actually sell it to the people. So when you understand that, this is like everything makes sense. So I learned that since the beginning when I started diving. So go to the ocean and just pick up whatever I need, but just when in the right size and the right condition, and harvest the ocean. So talking about like globally, if we have like a regulation, like global regulation, we can do that way. I think we can tag in a different way, because like the ocean, just one ocean. The ocean don't have limits, it don't have borders, no countries in the ocean, just one ocean. And we can see today like all the pelagics just moving around, the whales just moving around. So if we still thinking in this way, obviously it works when you protect one area, but if we can get to the point we can protect the whole ocean, or like where all these fish is moving around, I think we can tag in a completely different way. But unfortunately, we're not in that position right now. Like, look at what year we are, and there's people still hunting whales. And one guy is protecting the whale for his whole life. He's in jail right now just for protecting whale. So I think we need to just wake up and study more education, see where your food come from, where actually, if that fisherman take the fish where actually farm the ocean, harvest the ocean, or it just was a massive boat, commercial fishing, take everything what he take from there, and that's the fish you actually take, So in my opinion is we need to study, and today we have the technology. Actually, when a fish is in your plate, you can take a picture of that fish and say where this fish come from. Asking when you go to a restaurant, market, everything. So my main message to the people here is like, don't eat Chilean salmon. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, we're talking about marine protected areas, but it is salmon farms in Chile, in national parks, in national reserves, and they just pollute everything in there. So that's kind of like my point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of opportunity to reform how we're taking fish from these like really far away open ocean areas, and be a little bit more local and sustainable in the way that we take from the ocean. I have one more question I want to ask, and then I want to hear everyone's point of view on how we can get involved in the different work that everyone's doing. But Shugi, I think one important thing about marine protected areas that's often forgotten or overlooked is it's a living laboratory, right? Like doing science in a very dynamic environment like the ocean, there's very little that you can control. So when you have a fully protected reserve, it's an opportunity to learn about how climate might be impacting an ecosystem. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the opportunities that come from having marine protected areas to support science?
Well, I think from a scientific perspective, it's really a no-brainer.
Yeah.
It provides us an opportunity to look at a baseline. So what does this system look like when there's no extraction? And ideally, if you design your MPA correctly, which takes a long time, and unfortunately, that process, I was a part of that process. I was a stakeholder. And as a stakeholder, I experienced the process was rushed. It was very quick. But it takes many, many years to identify, okay, we want to protect a suite of species, not just one or two, and we need to know where do they spawn, what time of year do they spawn, how far does the larvae travel, how many days is the larvae in the water column before it settles. So unfortunately at the time, we didn't, it was impossible to perform all the studies. We had to kind of go forward with what we had. But I think now we can compare areas inside and out. And we also see that some species don't respond like we thought they would. Because recruitment, the ability for a species or an individual to have a good spawn and have a lot of individuals in the next year, it's not linear.
Yeah.
We have good years, we have bad years. Sometimes we have cycles, many years in a row, and it could be the currents. It could be the currents going the wrong way. So if you're an inshore species and your larvae is going out, it never settles. And then all of a sudden, 10 years later, you have a really good period where it's ideal conditions, environmental conditions, and you have a huge, beautiful bloom. You have one species does really well. So the message, I think, for the MPAs off our coast is they are relatively new. And I think that it's going to take time, more time, for us to really know, okay, are these really working exactly how we intended? But to change anything right now, I think that the process is still pretty new. And they seem to be doing really well for those species that are inside the reserve, especially those relatively resident species.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and an important part of the law that established the Marine Protected Area Network was this idea that it could be adapted and adaptively managed is the wonky term. And that's the process that we're in right now. So I'll make a plug for, I'm tracking this process very closely. So fishon.us is a great place to go for information. I'm still getting things going. But if you want to get involved in how our protected area network is going to be adapted over the next 10 years or so, please follow along. And then I would also like to give you all the opportunity. What are different ways that folks can get involved in whatever their version of ocean conservation might look like from your perspective? Chad?
I know Yvonne Chenard is a mentor and hero to many of us, and they referenced this in the earlier panel about plastic, I think, and he talks about living an examined life. And what he means by that is kind of thinking through the impacts of your decisions you make. So, like Chugi mentioned, we have an incredible fishery here, and like he said, we should be buying our fish from, like, well-managed fishery. We should be buying our fish from the local fishermen that Dana Point, Newport, or in this ocean side. And there's CSAs like you have for vegetables, for fish, and you can get it straight from the fishermen. That's one way of sort of doing that and rewarding the fishermen who are following the rules and doing right. And I think, beyond that, it's just thinking about our impacts. And then last plug, Surfrider Foundation's grassroots organization. So of course we're doing stuff in communities, but get involved in your community, whether it's with us or anybody else, because it's a place where you can really make a huge impact and start building a community like this film festival is around people who care. And it'll be fun, you'll make a difference, and it's gonna make the world a better place.
Great. Yeah, on that note, I've been so inspired by all the speakers today and just very thankful to be here and to listen to everybody. As far as the fishing MPAs go and thing, I think it's a very delicate situation, because if we put up too many MPAs, then we could take away from our local fishermen, and then we're getting fish from Chile flown up here on a jet. So I think it's all being a participant, and there are meetings about the MPAs that are being put out there for the future. And the best way is to be there and experience it and help make decisions for the coast and your community.
Well, I'm going to echo. Here we go. I'm going to echo what's been said, but so I'm a scientist that really works to support local fishermen. That's my background, and I think as a consumer, we need to treat the ocean more like a farmer's market. So up until now, as a consumer, we go into a restaurant and you might say, Keith, I'm feeling like having some Chilean sea bass today. How about you? And that Chilean sea bass is not local. There's a huge carbon footprint associated with just getting it here. And who knows which nation caught it, and we don't even have any clue about the gear. But what we do know is there's a local fisherman that's starving. He cannot make ends meet, and we have some fantastic chefs. Like last night, they can make almost any species, if it's fresh, taste wonderful. So for the consumer, I think that it's really important that we look to our local resources, and we try to get away from the mentality of I want what I want when I want it. We need to be more receptive to what's available and and what can support my local. I mean, we talk about endangered species, fishermen. They are, because it's really difficult nowadays to compete against the foreign countries that can. There's so many parallels with what was spoken, what was mentioned earlier this morning. We need to look at responsible fishing operations and really reward them. And that's kind of my take home.
Yeah, thank you. Ramon, do you want the last word?
Well, I take everything what you guys say, for sure. It's exactly what I always see since day one in the ocean. And for me, I just can say it's a hope. It is a big hope. The ocean, they have the capacity to get back. And we see that thing in many places. And for that, we need all together. We need to be just one ocean nation. All together, we can make the change. Like every single thing you guys say, if we put all together and mix it, it's going to be that. Study, love the ocean, know the ocean, and then you're going to protect the ocean, and then every single piece of the ocean you put in your mouth is going to come out with conscience, you know? You're going to know exactly where it comes from, and you're going to value it way more. And that fisherman is going to make better life living exactly the same way they used to be 100 years ago. So we are part of the solution, but we need to be all together. It's exactly like everyone talking the plastic things in the panel before. It's exactly, we need to be all together, and we can make the change, but as a family.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And being here to listen and learn is a part of that process. So thank you all for your time.